the idea that there would be, people that are exploiting typically younger children in positions of vulnerability, in my eyes, is just something that I think of Dr. Martin Luther King, that said, for evil to succeed, good men stand by and do nothing. And, it's one of those things where I just think, why would we ever stand by if this is happening?
Today you will meet Ryan Berg, a visionary dedicated to changing lives through the Aruna Project. It's an organization he co-founded with his wife, April, and a passionate commitment to end sex trafficking. The Aruna Project stands as a true beacon of hope. It offers freedom, employment, and true dignity to women who've been trapped in the darkness of sex trafficking. Ryan and his team work in regions heavily impacted by trafficking, both in the United States as well as overseas in Southeast Asia. And they provide survivors with these opportunities for a new beginning, for a new life, using truly out-of-the-box innovative approaches the whole way through. They also include this creation of an upscale athletic clothing and accessories business that employs only survivors. Now, the Aruna Project not only raises awareness of trafficking, but it also contributes to this lifelong freedom and rehabilitation of those who are affected. Ryan and April Berg and the Aruna Project are truly a testament to the power of hope, of faith, of resilience, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Hi, Ryan, and welcome to How We Change the World.
How are you, Deborah? Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. I mentioned ahead of time, I've heard about you for about less than a year, but I've been following your work a little bit. Your wife and you have an organization you started, and what you're doing has been so impactful in the world that I think a lot of people will be interested in how you started your work and what it means to you and what the impact has been. So thank you so much for taking the time and explaining it all to us, which I anticipate that you will do.
Sure.
Okay, so the subject is you help women, I think it's all women, who have been trafficked for sex, both in the United States as well as overseas. I don't know if there's just a few countries that you work in. I know you've kind of focused in Southeast Asia. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
So is it just one or two countries, or how is that?
Yeah, so basically we decided to try and really understand the issue of human trafficking, specifically sex trafficking, because human trafficking is a massive issue, and then there's particular types. And we got exposed to what was taking place in the sex trafficking aspect of human trafficking, and decided to try and understand it more, and to really kind of dive in to seek to understand, why is this happening, who's doing what, where are the gaps, really just to see, is there anything that we have that we could offer to bring about change. And so we actually started to do a little bit of a survey of different countries, different places, and found, quite honestly, that it's an issue that affects every single country around the world. But in some countries, there are certain factors that kind of coalesce, come together to cause an environment where it just seems to thrive. And so in that way, we decided, okay, we're going to focus in on some of those particular areas. So right now we're focused very, very specifically in on one particular country that we've got multiple locations in that country, but it is the most significant amount of slaves in the world today. And so we decided, okay, we're going to focus in on that. And if we can help to create some solutions there, then we have the potential to replicate it in other locations.
Is there a reason why you're not saying the country name, or, is that purposeful?
Yes. Yeah. We usually just, we'll typically use names like South Asia. We'll talk about the general region and things like that. Because as you can imagine, some of the work that we do, we're going up against some challenging situations, and oftentimes there are some levels of corruption
Mm-hmm.
that are in certain areas of authority. And so
Yeah.
typically if there's something like this, it's, more of a broadcast. We just keep things a little bit more
Okay.
general in terms of
Yeah.
locations.
That's very wise, actually. I was about to say what I thought it was, but then I realized, wait a minute, maybe this is intentional. So I'm glad that I asked. Um, okay, if you could you talk a little bit about what some of those factors are that would not be identifying to the country necessarily?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, and they're, generally speaking, typically true of what you see with human trafficking, and then even into sex trafficking. Typically, there's going to be some sort of, people being displaced in some way, whether that's internal to the country or leading to migration out of a country. So if there's any sort
You
of,
mean they had already been displaced before the sex trafficking?
they could be, yeah. So
Yeah.
if there's
Okay.
if there's significant displacement and people are in sort of migration or moving because of something that's happening, typically like war, regional conflicts,
Okay.
things like that, that puts them at very high risk.
Hmm.
Um, other things where it's not necessarily movement away, but where they are locally, would be things like gender inequality, lack of educational opportunity. If there are levels of corruption within
Mm-hmm.
authority structures, um, those are some of the key functions. And then obviously once you add in poverty,
So I was wondering.
if you've got those sort of all of those acting
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, then it puts certain people at very high risk for trafficking.
So, that's really, those are very, I guess you might expect that. From what you said, it kind of makes sense, but I had never really thought about, say, refugee situation because there's so many, or just internal displacement. I had not really put those together. But of course, it just makes perfect sense. You're vulnerable. It's when people
Mm-hmm.
are very vulnerable. But we see it also in the United States as well, which I do feel like that's something that people are not still aware of. We hear it sort of tangentially, but we don't hear many specific stories. I happened to meet someone a few months ago who had been trafficked, and it and the description of how she was trafficked in the U.S. is very different than the one that maybe happens in overseas, especially in Southeast Asia. Can you? And I heard you speak to that on another podcast. Can you talk about what that looks like in the U.S.
Sure,
a little
sure.
bit?
So typically in the US, what we've seen, and obviously what a number of other organizations that do work here have seen, is, you can refer to it in a number of different ways, but some of the common ways to refer to it is more of a
Mm-hmm.
Romeo pimp, where the vast majority of those who are trafficked for sex here in the US,
Mm-hmm.
there's typically the knowledge or some sort of relational proximity to the person who's going to do the trafficking. Now that's
Mm-hmm.
not always the case,
Right.
but typically that's what's
Huh.
happening. And so there are a number of these individuals that will actually, like you mentioned earlier, somebody who's in a position of vulnerability,
Mm-hmm.
somebody who a trafficker recognizes that, and then within that, proximity of that person in vulnerability, they'll start to do things where they'll start to shower praise, they'll start to give a lot of
Oh.
attention, they'll start to actually in some ways emotionally manipulate and take
Mm-hmm.
advantage of that vulnerability, and then start to, once they're starting to win them over, start to isolate them a little bit and start to kind of pull
Mm-hmm.
them out of any existing relationships. And once they start to do that, then they even kind of move a little bit more toward alienating any of those other relationships. So it's almost kind of driving a wedge between, hey, you're great, you're wonderful, they're bad, they're awful. And then it starts to
Wow.
move into things that become a little bit more illicit. So it might be starting to show pornography or have sex with them individually, and
Mm-hmm.
then maybe even start into certain substances, illegal substances, just to
Yeah.
get them hooked on things.
Oof.
And eventually they get to the point where they start to desensitize to what's taking place, whether it's sexual or whether it's drug use or different things like that, desensitize them, and then
Mm.
start to slowly introduce this idea of, if you really loved me, you would do this, this, or this, or hey, we're running so low on cash. I just need you to do this one
Gosh.
thing to get enough money so we can get the next hit of,
Yeah.
of,
Yeah.
of meth or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And at that point, then they start down the pathway, starting to capitalize on the
Wow.
person who's being trafficked.
That
So
is
sometimes that can be a
very
long
deliberate.
process. Yeah,
Yeah.
sometimes it can be a short process. Sometimes it's very clearly mapped out. Other times that's just kind of the ebb and flow of how it works
Hmm.
itself out. But it's a little bit more relationally manipulative, which is oftentimes what can be referred to as a Romeo pimp.
That almost perfectly describes the situation that this woman that I met was in. And I'm surprised to hear how deliberate that is. I've never heard of this before, that this, because that is quite a long, deliberate, well thought out, takes some intelligence, takes some psychological prowess. You wouldn't think there'd be that many people who could pull that off, so to speak, but it's pretty common in the US.
Mm.
I'm asking, actually, not
Yeah,
saying.
yeah. In terms of that method,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. There's and again that vulnerability. There's a number of you can look at different research and things like that. But one of a very basic study that's been done is called the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, that shows where there's certain factors that are absent in a child's life, or certain traumas that have been introduced into a
Wow.
child's life, that it can lead in certain pathways that make them much more vulnerable. And so oftentimes that can be a little bit of how they're brought into proximity of some of
Mm-hmm.
these people. And so
Okay.
in some of the young women that we've worked with here in the U.S., that's typically been the case, where there's not a very strong or home structure,
Mm-hmm.
and even drug use within the home, and that's brought in certain
Okay.
people into the home
I
that
see. Yeah. Makes it more
and yeah, and it kind of leads down that
likely.
pathway
Yeah.
of being trafficked.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to explain that, because I would not have thought of that as trafficking, and so this woman told me she was trafficked, and I thought, well, that's not really trafficked. I mean, just sort of this back of my mind thought that doesn't sound like trafficking, but but it's good to know, because we need to be aware of that. Most of the people listening to this program would be in the U.S., so that's why I want to kind of put a
And
exclamation point on that.
yeah, and if I could even just
Sure.
add to that, typically when the definition typically is of human trafficking is tied to this idea of authority and vulnerability, but more specifically to the idea of force, fraud, or coercion. And
Oh,
so oftentimes when people think of trafficking, they think strictly of the idea that it's done through force.
yes.
But typically, like especially here in the U.S., that does happen. But more you see the fraud and the coercion, and
Okay.
much of that Romeo pimp sort of style is much more driven by coercion and manipulation, and eventually gets to the point of fraud and violence. And so, after the first or second time, or third or fourth time, and a young woman starts saying, "No, I don't want to do this anymore," then is typically where that force and where that fraud comes into place, where they'll be met with physical violence and say, no, you are doing this. And if you
Mm-hmm.
don't, I've got all these videos, I've got all these pictures, and I'm going to share
Oh,
it all over. And so then it becomes
oh, so
fraud.
sad.
So on the US side, it can start with a little bit more of the manipulation and coercion, but
Mm-hmm. It gets
almost
there.
100% of the time it gets to the point of force and fraud.
And perhaps one more point to make on this topic before we move on is that it's not we have both said young women. It's not always young women. I mean,
Right.
you could have women in their 20s, 30s, 40s probably that are all still vulnerable. As long
Sure,
as.
and even in that regard, it can be males as well. And
Mm-hmm.
so,
Mm-hmm.
statistically, it's typically going to be a younger female. But
Mm-hmm.
you're absolutely correct that it can touch anyone who's in that
Mm-hmm.
position of vulnerability.
Yeah, even young mothers, who are desperate to
Hmm.
support their families. Okay, well, we are going to get to the work eventually that you are involved in, and that the way that you're helping. But I'd like to back up before we go there and talk a little bit about how you became involved in this, because it's you started this, and the name of your organization is the Aruna Project, and that's not the full story, but that's the main organization that you're um, presenting with, I guess we could say, and. You started, I think, back in 2009, and we're in 2024. So this has been, I could tell by the way you speak about it that you're very educated in this now. But when you started off, you were not. You were just trying to feel your way through it. So how did it begin for you? How did you maybe stumble upon it, or did you go searching for this mission?
Yeah, actually, we created the organization in 2014, and so
Okay.
that 2009 date that you're referencing is when we first got exposed to what was taking
Okay.
place, and then we spent, and when I say we, my wife and I spent about 5 years trying to understand and trying to do the research and trying
Oh
to
my
learn as much as we
goodness.
possibly could.
Unbelievable.
And so so in 2009, I was headed overseas for some work
Okay.
and was walking through an airport and saw on a little ticker line that made reference to 12 children being freed from a brothel. And it floored me. I had no idea. I didn't know that sex trafficking existed. I didn't
Oh, you
know that this was
didn't.
taking place. Had no idea in 2009.
Interesting. Hmm.
And I can't even remember when movies like Taken had come out. I'm
Yeah,
not sure if,
right. Well,
Liam
people don't
Neeson
talk
was,
about it much, and
yeah.
definitely not then. Yeah.
But I remember seeing it for the first time and thinking, if that is happening, how are we not rallying people to bring an end to
Right.
this?
Right.
And it just so happened that when I got home, I Googled and looked up some things online and realized the very place that I was going was a destination location for sex trafficking. And so I told my wife, I said, when I get there, I'm going to find this. And if there's something that we can do, we have to do something. But that phrase, if there's something we can do, I thought,
Oh,
certainly there's nothing that we're going to be able to
that's
do.
really
And so,
interesting. Yeah.
yeah, I assumed that, I'm not going to be able to find it. And if I do, there's already going to be a lot of, activity. There's already going to be government officials. There's already going to be so many different
Oh,
systems in place to bring about change that there's nothing we're going to be able to do to have an
your
impact.
naivete, because
Yes.
one would expect that. And I'm
Yeah.
going to back you up just to take a slight other detour, I guess. When you say, you and your wife, all right, so you're married. I don't know if you had children at the time. Did you have children
Mm-hmm.
at the time?
Yes. 3.
Okay. So you have 3 children?
Mm-hmm.
So you said, okay, that's beautiful. So what was it in your past before that? I know that you're a religious couple, and your faith is very important to you. Is that what led you to this thought process? Was it a faith driven impulse, and what were you doing before that?
Yeah,
Not
quite
That's
honestly.
very rare. What you did, you called your wife and you both say, "Okay, let's work on this for 5 years." That doesn't happen very often. So.
Yeah, quite honestly, Deborah, I mean, so the reality is, yes, we look at people and think that people are of exceptional value. And, whether you're the CEO of a Fortune 100 company or, wherever else you might find yourself on the economic or leadership ladder,
Mm-hmm.
we think people are of tremendous value. They are tremendous value to God, and that matters. And so the idea that there would be, people that are exploiting typically younger children
Mm-hmm.
in positions of vulnerability,
Mm-hmm.
in my eyes, is just something that I think of Dr. Martin Luther King that said, for evil to succeed, good men stand by and do nothing. And, it's one of those things where I just think, why would we ever stand by if this is happening? And so, from a young age, that's just kind of how I've been wired. If you see
Mm-hmm.
something that's being
Okay.
done to someone that's not okay, you intervene. You step in and try and do what you can to help. And so we've both kind of had that. That's kind of woven into both, the faith that we share in Christ, and
Mm-hmm.
then even just kind of the way that we view people. And so, from our perspective, once we learned about what was taking place, again, we didn't think that we would be drawn into it to the extent that we have been. But we thought, at least, at minimum, we've got to educate ourselves and then see if there is something that we can do to contribute.
That's beautiful. I mean, if we stopped right now, that would be enough to know that there's a couple, and the fact that you're working with your wife, and that's part of your relationship, that's part of your your life's work now. It's just very, very powerful and very unusual. Does that help, the fact that you're doing this as a couple? Is that the strength of it? Has that always been the strength of it? Because you're both fully 100% doing this, right? This is
Yeah,
your
absolutely. We're
life. Yeah.
co-founders. We started it in our third floor attic of our home. I mean,
Yeah.
so we're very, very much, co-founding it together. She's got gifts and skills that I don't have and vice versa. And so we complement each other very well. But we also have to be very intentional about, once we get home, that
Separating.
work conversation does not continue on into the evening, especially when you're talking about,
Right.
things as violent as sex trafficking. And so we try to make sure that we've got some good boundaries and try to make sure that we just enjoy some of the other joys of life together.
For sure.
And being able to experience just the joy of marriage together.
And it's an important point, I think, for anybody who's trying to make a change in this world, and that you do have to separate. You still have to find the joy in life. You can't focus so much on even the work that you're doing, as important as it is, that you have to stop that and separate put a boundary between your personal life, because it can pull you down. Any kind of work that you're doing that is this troubling, this heart-wrenching, can overwhelm you. You get compassion fatigue, you get a lot of things, and you actually take it on and absorb it. I know I certainly absorb people's pain, and I'm not very good at making that boundary. So it's just an important thing to do for the longevity of a situation.
Absolutely.
So what happened then when you first, so you see this story happening on the ticker, you go home and you talk about it with your wife, then you say the place that you're going to is one of those places. What do you do next?
Yeah, so I had a number of meetings and decided in between those meetings to try and actually find one of these particular locations, and found this particular area. And from the sights and smells and sounds, it was a very difficult area.
You mean the whole neighborhood in general?
The whole neighborhood, yeah, the whole neighborhood, and just the quality of life in this particular area. And found this particular entranceway, and this is a public brothel, so you've got people coming in and out of this. It's all illegal, but
it is illegal. Okay, that's
100% illegal.
Okay.
And but in this particular entrance, kind of made my way up through this entrance, and it was really, really dark inside. And as I start up the stairs, I can start to hear the sound of abuse. And once I got to the top of the staircase and it opened up into the hallway, there were literally just these, closet-sized rooms with just mattresses and pull curtains and young women they were physically there, but they were mentally and emotionally in a completely other place. And so,
how are you allowed to? I mean, did you just pose that you were going in as a customer and they said go on up, or how were you able to gain access?
Yeah, so it's really interesting the way that some of these sort of, internationally it looks different again than it does typically here in the U.S.
Sure.
And in this particular building, so some of the different buildings operate differently, from building to building, region to region, nation to nation. They, it can look very different
culturally.
And in this particular building, this sort of entryway, the way that the system works, is there would be someone who goes to the countryside, tells all these stories about young women having great work in the city, very deceptive, and that's kind of the initial trafficker that will then bring that young woman and sell them to the brothel owner. The brothel owner will typically keep them kind of tucked into the internal parts of this brothel, sometimes, even actually in like boxes. And then from there, once they're broken, they're then handed over to someone who oversees the hallways. And once they've been in that hallway setting for, sometimes it can be weeks, sometimes it can be months, they're eventually then released to work the streets in a street level pimp. And so there's a very sort of organized hierarchy of how the system works. And so for the entrance into that doorway to get up into that hallway level, it's because it is a public brothel, people are just in and out, walking in and out all the time. And so the pimps are, they're trying to broker people in, kind of broker deals, talk about, what girls they have inside. And so it's a very active area, but it's also a very violent area.
So no one questions you. You were just able to go in and look around, see who was there. So there's no one protecting them.
yeah, once I got into that sort of floor level, they recognized that we were there for facts and
So were you?
made us leave.
Oh, they did. Well, were
Yeah.
you able to speak to any of the girls or anything at that point?
Not at that point. No, it was more just visually seeing what was taking place, and and kind of understanding the dynamics of what was going
Mm-hmm.
on in terms of
Right.
sort of the hierarchy. Um, and it was all I needed to see to
Yeah.
to be just devastated
I was going to
inside
ask you
and
how you
think,
felt. Yeah.
oh my goodness, it was overwhelming. I had never seen anything like it before. I had up to that point had never seen
Mm-hmm.
slavery before face to face. And little did I know that I would spend, you know,
Change your
years
life.
in environments like that, in total, trying to help create freedom.
So, did you know at that moment that you were going to do actually take some serious action? Did you feel so moved by that experience that it was sort of a given?
Yeah, pretty much. There was no way I could walk away. As a matter of fact, I remember, coming once I got back to the U.S., the faces of some of those young women were just, I mean, they were so clear in my
Mm,
mind. And I remember trying to voice that to April, my wife, and she was like, "Well, what do you think we should do?" She was right in, like, "All right, well, what are we going to do about it?" And so, which was really encouraging for me to just know, all right, if we're going to be in it, we got to be in it together. And she's ready to go.
wow. It's very emotional. It really, it's beautiful that you found this in each other and found the strength in each other to start. So then that's it. Then what was the next step? And then what, I do want to get to what you do today, but it's really, it really is helpful, I think, to go through your stages and how this began, because it kind of drives home when you want to make a change in the world. There's a lot of different ways it may present itself to you, the opportunity. And I would think that a lot of people might have the opposite reaction, that this is too much for me. This is too hard. The trauma is too great. You're seeing these faces, you get home and, they're kind of haunting you. And to think that's just the beginning of what you're going to see it's not easy. So it took a lot of courage.
Yeah, and I think, to your point, the initial stage for us was to try and learn.
Yeah.
We recognized there is a whole lot that we don't understand here. And so we really need to seek to understand,
Yeah.
a lot of what's happening here before we
Yeah.
even think that we can start to,
Mm-hmm.
share any ideas or thoughts
Right.
about any potential solutions. And
Yeah.
so I actually went back for a handful of months without April and the kids,
Mm-hmm.
and just tried to understand. So I met with government officials, nonprofit leaders, women in the
Wow.
area, asked 1,000 questions: mission, vision, values, methods, constraints, anything we could to try and understand, why is this happening,
Mm.
and who's doing what, where are the gaps, what solutions are working, what aren't, where's the sort of proof of sustainability. And the biggest sort of wrestling point that came out of all of that was how high the re-trafficking rates were.
What
And
do you
so
mean by re-trafficking?
so what we learned was pretty quickly that if a young woman, for example, were forcibly rescued. So somebody came in and did a raid and got her out. And at that point, if there was not a
Oh,
really good follow-up structure in place, what could happen is within a matter of 2-3 months she could be re-trafficked if there weren't a number of sort of key components in place. Then
makes
the
sense.
re-trafficking rates were extraordinarily high.
Yeah.
And so we started to look at that and think, okay, there's got to be a better way to actually create lifelong freedom. And the more we started to wrestle with it and have conversation about it, the more people said, well, you realize the depth of that journey and how long that journey is going to take. And so there's a lot of funding that goes in the front end of
Okay.
doing an operation to get a girl out, and then you kind of move on, and that girl then what are the next steps for that young girl? And I
Wait, so
just
even
found,
if they go back to their family, they're still vulnerable.
they can be, yeah,
Yeah.
especially if, and that's one of the key components is you have to make sure that there's a really strong relational dynamic that's going to want to help
Okay.
her succeed.
Yeah.
There's also got to be physical proximity to where she's no longer in proximity to somebody that may have trafficked in the past or may have been abusive in the past that put her initially in the position of
Okay.
vulnerability.
Because I know that sometimes parents do, or relatives or cousins or something will actually be part of the selling process in certain
Right,
cultures. So,
right.
so you're talking a very complex situation that you're trying to solve. Like,
Yes.
determine whether they have a good relationship, whether it's safe, all these things. Do they have?
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, what we ended up doing is we through that research, and some of this is from the State Department's Trafficking in Persons report, the International Labor Organization,
Mm-hmm.
professional trauma counselors, and tried to and a number of nonprofits on the ground and tried to pull together all the information. And we then developed something that we refer to as our 4 pillars of holistic care. And
Okay.
we said anything that we create has to be undergirded by these 4 pillars to ensure her sustainable lifelong freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And so we decided, all right, we're going to start with a business. That's going to be the end goal. And then we're going to work our way backwards right up to the front door of those brothels and try and
Oh,
make sure that we're
really?
creating a very clean process, step by
Oh,
step by step,
okay.
that is done in partnership with other organizations, but is absolutely airtight so that we have those pillars of holistic care, making sure that she doesn't fall through, making sure that she's not re-trafficked. And I would say by God's grace, we've seen a significant reduction in those re-trafficking rates, and we're operating at a very high percent of lifelong freedom. So, and part of that's through the process, but also part of that is the tremendous perseverance that these young women have to be able to go through what they've gone through and be in their, be able to come out the other side and actually thrive is absolutely incredible.
This is amazing. So you start with the business, and the business is Aruna. So
Correct.
that's the first step that you took. Let's establish a business to create the funds that will allow for whatever is going to happen next to happen. This is very long range thinking. I don't know if I've ever heard of anyone doing this before. Even in a regular business, it's usually so much faster. So this is so well thought out. No wonder it's working so well.
Well, we initially, quite honestly, we thought through the business concept and we thought, okay, we're when you look at the athleisure, so Aruna is a premium athleisure bags and accessories brand. And we were looking at the athleisure industry and we're saying, okay, the compounded, annual growth rate of this is really healthy. There's good margins on the product, the cultural, sort of dynamics happening in the West. This has staying power. We thought, okay, this is a good business opportunity. And then we were looking at some of the cultural realities, what was happening here in the West, especially with millennial and Gen Z, that were saying they would shift brands for a good cause and how much they value human impact. So we thought there's a really good business case to be made for creating this business that's going to employ 100% of our products would be made by trafficking survivors. So it provides for these young women because there's a market of the products that they could produce. And so pitched it to a group of investors and they were like, this is crazy. This is impossible. And so we thought, okay, well, we've got to figure out another way to actually create the seed capital to launch the business. And so
why did they not see the viability of that business model? Why did they think that was crazy?
Sure. Yeah. Primarily because of the nature of the environment that the people that we were going to be employing in the business were coming out of.
They didn't think they could be sustainable employees in a sense.
Right. Yeah. They just thought the trauma's too great, the lack of education, trying to do it internationally, you're not going to be able to hit the quality or the throughput that's necessary to make it profitable.
So they didn't see your vision. They weren't seeing what you were seeing.
They saw the social value. They didn't necessarily see.
They didn't see the business value.
Yeah.
Okay. All
Um,
right. Continue.
and so interestingly enough, and that's okay.
Sure. That's what
And
happens.
so, yeah, allowed us to kind of think a little bit more creatively where we brought in
Mm,
and basically combined the best of nonprofit and business together into our
yeah.
current model.
Yeah.
And so what we did on the nonprofit side, and there's plenty of for-profits that have a nonprofit arm. We're actually a nonprofit that has a
Yeah.
for-profit arm. And part of that is to actually even preserve some of the mission of what we're doing is so that 100% of what's coming through into the business goes right back in to try and ensure that we're freeing and employing and empowering more women. And so what we did is we started on the nonprofit side with these Aruna runs all across the U.S. and designed them to be volunteer led, created out resources, online training mechanisms, everything like that.
Well, say what those are. Say what an Aruna run is. It's maybe not as obvious as it sounds.
Sure.
It's a physical
So
run, right? It's like
yeah,
it's a
yeah,
race,
it's
running race.
absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So it's a 5K run, or you can have a 1 mile, you can have a 10 mile,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
but it's a run, and people can run, they can walk. But the whole concept is how we've developed it is you
Mm-hmm.
run or walk for a young woman that we're
Mm-hmm.
working to set free.
Brilliant.
And all of the money and the awareness that gets raised through those runs then goes into the next step of this sort of flywheel model that we've created where it goes into our training centers. And so our training centers are in the heart of multiple areas of high trafficking. And it's through those training centers that our teams are going in to help create the pathway out for women. And once those women are then freed, they step into an apprenticeship program that has trauma counseling. It's got skill and trade development, transitional housing, individualized care plans. And that's kind of the last stage of the nonprofit side. And once they've moved through those stages, we then offer them employment in the for-profit side. And in the business, they've already been trained up to, in soft goods manufacturing. They've gone through significant amount of trauma counseling. And so as they step into the business, they're earning a career wage, retirement savings, access to healthcare.
Wow.
And then we also make sure that we still have some of the particular trauma informed workplace that we're trying to do. So we continue on with those individualized care plans, just to make sure that the
Oh,
women are able to continue to meet their needs.
that's a lot. That was a lot you just said. And it's a lot that you've done. I want to unpack that just a little bit more because
Sure.
there was a whole lot in there. So you raised the money, you started these runs, which is brilliant to think of one person. So you have like a picture of a woman, a story of a young girl or a woman who's been trafficked, and a person who runs. Do they specifically know who that is, or they just say, I'm running for a woman or I'm running for a person? Or do they
Yeah,
know?
we actually have something we refer to as ethical storytelling. So we don't share names or
Right.
faces or anything like that unless
Okay.
we're given permission.
Mm-hmm.
And so every one of the women that we're working with has a pseudonym. And so that pseudonym will be
I see.
used so if somebody ran in a run, they're running for the pseudonym of Reshma, an individual. And so you're
Mm-hmm.
running specifically for that individual.
I just think
And
that's
so,
brilliant.
and
It
we,
makes me feel like I want to go run right now because it's never personal when you run for
yeah,
something.
yeah.
I've never even heard anything like this. It's amazing.
Well, and part of the reason we did it is because when we started doing all of the research, so much of the research was always just about the numbers and numbers
Right.
and numbers. And
Exactly.
so in our thinking, it was kind of like this kind of perpetuates the dehumanization of
Oh,
trafficking itself. And so we want to bring the
wow.
humanity back to this. And we
Yeah.
want to say these are individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And
That's
so that's
huge.
kind of one of the key components. Yeah.
My goodness. Okay, so you raised the money. You started raising money from these races over time as you
Mhm.
were developing the process, and then
So
what?
like in that 5 year gap, 2009
Yeah.
to 2014, that's what we were doing with these runs. We were kind of developing out these runs, um, before we were able to actually launch the actual entity.
So how are you managing it in the country where you're working? How were you then? What was the? How was it developing on that end of things?
Yeah, we were spending a lot of time with partner organizations. We were trying to
Okay.
figure out what their operations were and how to actually help their operations succeed.
Locally.
Uh, yes,
Locally.
locally,
Okay.
so that then as we launched the business side, we were already helping to create that sort of pipeline or pathway of
Oh.
freedom into the business.
So that was really brilliant also. So because I was when I had read about what you were doing ahead of time before we started speaking, I'm thinking, how does a man, first of all, from the US who's white, walk into this foreign country and try to talk these girls into getting, this is what I was envisioning, is that you're going in and saying, hey, we've got something better to offer you than this life. But you didn't start that way. Some partner organizations were doing that. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Okay, yeah,
yeah.
because that makes so much more sense.
Yes, my time spent inside some of those places
Mm-hmm.
is more to confirm what some of the young women are hearing through some of the organizations, and then obviously through our own
Mm-hmm.
organization, what our teams are communicating. So we have, indigenous leaders that are
Mm-hmm.
actually doing that work.
Yeah.
And anytime I'm spending time in there, it's for me to kind of understand what the nature of kind of this particular area is like,
Mm-hmm.
to see if there's any different sort of strategic dynamics that we would incorporate. But it's also, if I'm engaging with any of the young women in that setting, it's to
Mm-hmm.
confirm what's already been said, that hey, there's this
Okay.
U.S. company, there's a job opportunity. Um,
Okay.
so it's, yes, I am not the lead
Yeah. Yeah.
person in connecting with them.
Well, the people who are doing that work, how do they convince? Like, I don't. You probably can't talk in too much detail, but just maybe generally speaking, how do they approach the young girls or women that are? Some of them, I know from, as I said, we have mutual friends, Sarah Davis and Tracy, who wrote a book about about Nepal specifically, and untouchable class of women who were at high risk for being trafficked, and her story was about how they were actually being rescued by their own. Um, and in that book, she talks about the numbers and the ages. Maybe just even girls younger than 10 are being trafficked, which is hard to even say out loud. And also just the numbers and the lifelong sentence that it is. They typically are not freed ever until they're so old that they're not able to bring in any more business, and then they're basically left to die somewhere. So for you to be able to go in your organization or these partner organizations, it's a big thing to break someone from that, to give them the faith, to give them the value, that they even have value, the idea that they even have any value as a human being anymore. Because you referred to something earlier, which I didn't really want to ask about, but I will ask about, when you said they're broken, sometimes put in a box and broken, psychologically broken. I'm assuming you mean, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard for me to to truly express in words the depth and the impact, negative impact, that the trauma has on the way it affects some of the young women. Um, yeah, it's really hard to put it into words. If you would see kind of the first point of engagement inside that brothel,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and just how dehumanized some of them have become. But then conversely, to actually see where many of them are now, you wouldn't even think they're the same person. It
Really?
is absolutely incredible when you see all of the transformation that has taken place, and when you see, many of them that have stepped in, they're now team leaders within our company, others that have stepped beyond our company, some that have gotten their master's degrees, some that have gotten married, they've started their families, some even that have started their own, businesses back in their villages. It's pretty incredible. And again, it's a
Oh,
testament to their perseverance, their strength, their,
yeah.
continued pursuit of healing.
Humans are resilient. They
Yeah,
are.
it's pretty amazing.
It is very amazing. So somehow they're able to convince them that there's. Do they have to kidnap them to get them out? or do they talk them
No,
into it? Is it
yeah.
a
And we never,
well, I guess I don't mean to use that term, but I mean, I'm just wondering if they're free to choose to go or if they're being held there.
yeah, so it's typically a very complex sort of scenario. Again, it
Mm-hmm.
depends on individual, it depends on the pimp, the hallway, the brothel owner, a
Okay.
number of different scenarios. But generally speaking,
Mm-hmm.
if she's under the age of 18 in this particular region of the world, if she's under
Mm-hmm.
the age of 18, there has to be some sort of operation that takes place where you're going to go in and actually try and free by force.
Okay.
But you have to have government involvement in that process.
Mm-hmm.
And then it goes into a government process of aftercare. And
Okay.
some of those systems and processes are just not very good. And sometimes those involved in some of the work are also corrupt. And so that can be a real challenge. If
Mm-hmm.
they're over the age of 18,
Mm-hmm.
then the whole dynamic changes because
Okay.
over the age of 18, they're typically going to be prosecuted for prostitution, even if
Oh.
they were trafficked there against their
Oh.
choice. And
Really?
so over the age of 18, you're typically not involving, government officials and things like that. And so instead, if the operative word under the age of 18 is like a raid, the word over the age of 18 is more relationship. And so that's where the teams our teams are showing up on a daily basis and just simply saying there is a pathway out. There is opportunity. Here's how this process works. And usually what happens is there tends to be these sort of moments in time, and I won't go into all the details, but usually we try and engage what we refer to as a secondary issue. And so for a young woman who's maybe inside that brothel, who has a
Mm-hmm.
child back in the village who really needs some medicine, we try with her to figure out, what do you think a good solution would be? And so the whole idea is, what we're trying to do is team up with her to show her
Oh.
respect, team up with her to work through a problem together that's
Mm-hmm.
deeply meaningful to her.
Right.
And, obviously that child means something to us as well. And so to try and actually work together to bring like a good resolution there. So we're providing something that's really helping her. That helps to develop a level of trust to where
Yeah.
when we start saying things like, hey, and there's a job opportunity for your future.
Mm-hmm.
She, months, maybe even years ago,
Mm.
has stopped hoping that there
Right.
is any hope for her future. And so there's even, trauma counselors will tell you this, there's even pain in reopening potential hope,
Oh, of
because if it
course.
crashes again. And so it's a very big step for them to start hope again and potentially start trusting in what we're saying.
Yeah.
And so part of that is we meet a need, and then we start to develop some of that trust. And oftentimes we start to see when a young woman will share with us her real name, not her call name, or she'll start to ask questions a little bit more about the potential future. We start to see, once those things start to happen, we start to notice
Percolating.
pretty quickly that we're close to the freedom. And then the freedom is very anticlimactic. It's,
So,
again, if she's over the age of 18, it's typically going to be, when no one else in this brothel is awake. Tomorrow we're gonna help you get out, and it's just gonna be quick. It's gonna be fast. If you've got anything of value, we're gonna be gone.
you said earlier that if they're over 18, they can be prosecuted for prostitution.
Mm-hmm.
So do they know that? Is that a potential thing? It's hard to even imagine that would be, because the government knows that they've been there not of their own volition, but regardless, when they come out at 18 or over, what happens next? How does anyone know that to prosecute them, or do they really actually do that? And how does that happen? How's that unfold?
Sure. Yeah. It again, it kind of depends on who the authorities are that are there.
Okay.
And so there's layer upon layer of challenge. A number of these women don't actually have birth certificates, and so in effect, they don't exist within the system.
Oh.
And so that makes them far easier to be trafficked. And
Right.
what it also does is if they're picked up on suspicion of prostitution and then they're taken to a jail and they're going to try and process them through for prosecute, they've got no real record of them.
Yeah.
And so then they kind of get stuck into this system of not being able to identify where they're from, not being able to identify who they're connected to. And sometimes they can almost kind of remain in jail indefinitely.
Oh, they do? Really?
And so, yeah, it can just be, it's a very complex sort of compounding issue.
I can see that.
And probably the best way to summarize it is if a girl's over the age of 18 and she hears that police are coming into the brothel, she is running or hiding as best or as fast as she can to stay as far away from those police as possible.
So they do occasionally go in and break up a brothel or try to put an end to it. Okay. So, all right. So you've, I kind of get lost in the stories and I forget that we need to move on, but so you have them out. Someone, they've released somehow and maybe gotten them out of jail or whatever the case may be. And then is there a place where you have set up then, and I guess this is again through partners, like a safe house or a whatever you'd like to call it, where they're safe immediately?
Yeah, so we've both got partners, and then we've also got our own work, and so we work back and forth together. And so from our training centers inside those brothel systems that are creating freedom, those are Aruna training centers, and then we have an Aruna apprenticeship program where once a young woman is freed, she can come to that training center program or to that apprenticeship program, and she has transitional housing there. And so we'll have young women that are coming there directly from our work to help get them out. But then we've also got women that are coming from other organizations that have helped to create freedom. And they're able to land in this apprenticeship program, get transitional housing, the trauma counseling, skill and trade development. And right now that skill and trade development is primarily focused in on soft goods manufacturing because of Aruna being a premium athleisure brand. What we're working on, and this is something into the future, is trying actually to develop out different pathways into other industries of interest where there's already really strong businesses that exist. And so what we're working on is trying to actually develop out partnerships with some of those existing businesses and then help create on-ramps into those other businesses so that the constraint of just the growth of our own business doesn't become a significant constraint to the amount of women being freed.
So, like, what would be an example of another business? Just another business in the same, making the same products that you make, or a different, just
yeah, part of what we're thinking is complete, like totally different industries.
Okay,
so not even soft goods manufacturing, but a hospitality industry or culinary industry. A number of others.
I mean,
and part of that would be that those businesses would engage with us through that apprenticeship program to make sure that they're getting the proper training and skills that are necessary.
This is so well orchestrated and thought out, especially as you think to the future that you can't even keep up with eventually you won't be able to keep up with your own business employing them because there's so many people being freed and getting through the process. So, let's talk about those products a little bit, because you've made also the very intentional decision to make it sustainable and to make the products, I don't know if they're recyclable as much as they are sustainable, but it's an eco-friendly brand. Was that part of the obviously attracting sales? You talked about Gen Z and Gen X and them really wanting to purchase products. Was that part of your intention? Was it because you wanted to be sustainable, or was it because you wanted, because you knew it would be more marketable to the audience?
Well, one of our core values is people over product. And so what we mean by that, and that goes the whole way down our entire value chain. And so for us, we didn't want fabric suppliers that had any sort of questionable labor practices within their supply chain.
Oh,
And
oh,
so for us, we basically said, if we're
oh,
an anti-trafficking organization that values people, we need to make sure that even the suppliers that we're trying to pull in fabric from,
okay.
that we're aligned in terms
Yeah.
of the
Morally, yeah.
values. So there's something referred to as blue sign certification related to fabric,
Okay.
and in companies that produce fabric.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, and I'm going to summarize a really long process, but that blue sign certification has to do with things being like eco-friendly standards, and making
Okay.
sure that supply chain, that there aren't questionable labor practices.
Okay.
So for us, we said, okay, we're gonna utilize blue sign certified fabrics as much as we're possibly able,
Mm-hmm.
and we're going to use recycled materials as much as we're possibly able. Uh, but that also comes as a cost. There's a
Sure.
cost
It's
of
a
doing
premium.
business that way,
Mm-hmm.
and so, for example, if we're importing, because in our particular area there are no blue sign certified companies, so if we're importing that
Mm.
fabric in, we get hit with a massive duty
Oh,
tax,
okay.
just to get it inside the country, and then we get hit with another, duty tax, once we bring it into the U.S. to actually sell it. So, but we've basically just said, all right, we know that we're going to have to work that into our margin structure. We know that that's just the cost of doing business the way that we want to do
Hmm.
it.
Yeah.
And it certainly makes it more challenging. It certainly
Yeah.
makes it more difficult. We have to be pretty focused in how we execute.
Well, and people pay premiums. They're willing to pay premiums when they know that it's sustainable, when they know it's organic, when they know it's, not doing harm, when you're not harming people. So there is that knowledge out there, and there's a market out there. So that's fortunately, but I know it's still a tremendous challenge for you. Um, I didn't even realize how long I kind of got so taken with your whole story. So I hope I'm not going on too long. But I want to get to a couple more quick things. First of all, so these women in where you're working are creating the manufacturing process, and they're working in the manufacturing process in this country. What about women in America? What are they doing? Is that a different setup?
Yep, totally different setup.
Yeah.
So here it's much more. It's once all that product comes in, it's
Oh.
basically doing all of the operations on the back end. So it's
Oh,
bringing that
really?
product in, doing
Huh.
all of the quality control check.
Hmm.
It's doing all the inventory management, getting it all tagged, getting it prepped, getting it put into the systems,
Okay.
and then even on the order fulfillment side, it's once an order gets placed, it's pulling it out, it's making sure that it's tagged and it's ready to go. So
Hmm.
it's one of the last set of hands that touches it before it actually gets to the end customer.
Oh, I didn't even realize you were going to say they were also working in the same business. I didn't get that. So that's fantastic.
Yep.
So, wow, this is so interesting. And the items that you sell, they're backpacks, purses, what other type of items do you sell?
Yeah, so we've got backpacks, we've got duffels, we've got crossbodies,
Mm-hmm.
purses. We've got different hair accessories,
Okay.
and all of them are designed to be a little bit. They're elevated athleisure, so we refer to them as premium athleisure. So the design is to be used not just kind of an athleisure feel with leggings or something like that, but
Mm-hmm.
also to be able to actually carry over into the workplace, to carry out
Okay.
into a
Yeah.
nice evening out on the town,
Wow.
to be able to travel a
Mm-hmm.
weekend or a week or 2 weeks. And so we try
Hmm.
to make sure that they're very, very well done, high quality, but also really strong functionality and really good aesthetic.
Yeah. I'm actually eager to know about it because I wasn't familiar with the brand. Is it sold online specifically?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
At arunaproject.com. And then we've got some select retailers,
Oh, do you?
but we've basically tried to just operate direct to the customer because of
Mm-hmm.
because of
Margin.
our margin structure,
Yeah.
and
Right.
it's been really exciting to see our last 5 months in 2023 where we were consistently hitting record sales.
Oh, that's really
Uh,
exciting. Yeah.
yeah, which is just neat to see.
And it's a fairly good size operation in the US, right? Do you say you have 30 some employees? Did I see that?
So we've got total. We've got about the total operation. We've got about
Mm-hmm.
125
Oh,
employees.
between here and
Here it
overseas?
is overseas. Yeah.
Okay. All
Yep.
right. And is it not well known because when I'm thinking in the U.S., so women are all over the country that are being trafficked. Do they
Yeah.
come to where you are? You're in Pennsylvania?
We're in Cincinnati, Ohio. So
where I
our
got that.
our U.S. engagement really only is kind of
Local.
currently within just our tri-state area.
Okay.
Again, part of that is, our sort of future plan and direction of where we want to go is
Mm-hmm.
we really want to start to aggressively pursue scaling
Do
Aruna,
you?
because we just know that we've been able to actually see the impact that it has. We've been able to sharpen in some of the things that help truly create lifelong freedom. And so we're at the point now where we think, okay, if we can actually scale, then the amount of additional impact for others
That's
is
very
going to be
exciting.
significant. So
Very, very, very exciting. Are you unique in this? I have not heard about this model before. Is this something, I know you invented it, you and April, but have others emulated it, or are you still quite unique in what you're doing, in the way that you're creating?
I would say, as far as like an athleisure company who's 100% of our products are made by freed women, we're extraordinarily unique. As far as businesses, like freedom businesses that are employing women who have been freed, we're actually one of many. I serve
Oh,
on the board of directors of something called the Freedom Business Alliance,
I want to
and
ask you what that was.
there's probably 110 businesses in about 28
Okay.
different countries that are a part of the Freedom Business Alliance that are doing similar things. Now, some of them are on very early stage. Uh,
Okay.
Different types of products. Many of those products are not imported to the U.S. for a Western audience. They're more
Mm-hmm.
localized. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of variation
Many
within
models.
those
Mm-hmm.
businesses. Um, but it's exciting to see. It's exciting to actually see
It's
that there is some growth in it.
It's so, so, so exciting. Well, I had mentioned our friend Sarah Davison Tracy earlier, and she runs an organization called Seeds of Exchange, where she does sort of joint fundraising for a number of different groups I think, 6 times a year. And that's how you came to my attention, that January and February of 2024, right now, as this will air at the beginning of February, um, she's all of her funds are going to support a project that you are trying to get off the ground or going to get off the ground, a specific project. Can you describe what that is? What the
Yeah, it's
project
actually
is?
that apprenticeship program. It's basically trying to advance some of those next stages and phases of that apprenticeship program to help create multiple pathways for women into sustainable
Oh,
employment.
okay. So now we're talking back overseas when you're saying, because you're kind
Yeah.
of maybe hitting the limits of the work that you can support.
Mm-hmm.
So anyone who donates to this fund will help support finding new pathways for them. Is that
Yep,
essentially?
to sustainable employment. Yes. Yeah, our whole mission is to create lifelong freedom. And so uh, whether that's with us in Aruna and what we're producing, or whether that's somebody who goes into Aruna and then steps beyond us, or if somebody comes into Aruna for a period of time and then lands into another place, as long
Okay.
as the key components of that those four pillars of holistic care are
Mm-hmm.
present, uh, and they're no longer at risk for being re-trafficked, then we consider that success. It doesn't have to be with Aruna; it can be with other
Sure.
entities.
Wow. So if someone wanted to support you to keep this going, to grow it, they could either go to Aruna Project, which is ARUNA project.org. No, .com. .com.
.com, correct?
Yeah,
Yeah,
because this is the
.com.
business side of it. And by the way, I'm going to have these links everywhere on social, on the show notes and on our website, in case anybody, it's hard to remember sometimes. But
Sure.
so any product. So if I go buy a duffel bag on arunaproject.com, what is there a way that you say what percentage or how much of that product, how much of the profit would go? I don't know if that's something you can
Sure. Yeah. So
specify.
basically we try and keep it pretty clean. So when
Okay.
somebody purchases that duffel, the purchase price of that duffel that money all goes right back into that freedom business. And so that's paying for salary. It's paying for the ongoing
Oh,
holistic care. It's paying for. So, for example, I don't make any money through the nonprofit. I get paid or I don't make any in the for-profit. I only get paid through the nonprofit side.
oh, I see. So it's
Because
literally 100% of it goes back to the
that's the way we've
process.
designed it. And so
Okay.
that for-profit is considered one of the programs underneath our nonprofit. And so we can make sure that that sales revenue continues to fund the
Whoa.
lifelong freedom of the artisans.
Okay. All right. What do you call this? It's not a social enterprise, is it? Or is it? Would you
Yeah.
call it that?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, we would call it a social enterprise for sure, and it is a little bit unique. I mean, we try and make sure the finances are split a little bit, just to make sure that we can track it clearly. Um, and it makes it challenging at times because sometimes people say, well, should I buy a product or should I donate? Like which
Do both.
should I do? And that's exactly how we respond. We're like, you can do both. You can help donate and
Yeah.
fund to the nonprofit side, and you
Right.
can purchase to help sustain. And we look at it literally as you can help accelerate freedom and you can help sustain freedom. That's kind of how the two sides operate together.
Okay. So the people that are paid, maybe you and April, or I don't know who all is involved in the nonprofit or how many salaries, is that that's supported through donation? It's not supported from some outside source or anything. That's
Correct.
just
Yeah.
that
True
all comes.
donation.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I will definitely have seedsofexchange.org, and if you go on there and you click on donate, you will see a description of this specific project that we're talking about that you would just describe. That's one way to help. Another way is just to go to arunaproject.com. I am so sorry. I wish I could go in and edit my words, and purchase a product. And that's very clean. That's a very clean way to do it. Or you could also go, this fundraiser through Seeds of Exchange is only through February. After that, what is the best way if you don't want to buy a product, but you simply want to donate directly? Where do they go?
We actually have at arunaproject.com. There is a right at the top on the website. You can actually click to donate, and it goes right into the nonprofit side as well.
Okay.
So when you go to arunaproject.com, you can purchase product or you can donate, either one. And if there's really adventurous folks, that they can even apply to host an Aruna run, and it comes in through the process.
Tell me more about that, because that gets my attention. Anywhere in the country? Anywhere in the world?
Yeah, absolutely. We were constrained to the U.S. just because of the nature of how the U.S. nonprofit works. But typically what will happen is somebody applies to host an event, it drops into our system, that gets vetted, and then one of our people on the team reach out and do an interview process. And after that, if somebody steps in as a race host, then we do a whole online training. We supply a number of material resources and a whole coaching booklet on how to execute. And then we actually even assign a particular Aruna Run coach to help walk you through the process. And so it's a ton of fun. We've had these runs, I think, in maybe 35 different cities across the U.S.
Have you? I'm surprised I haven't heard of it.
So it's a lot of fun.
All right. How long do people usually take to plan those? Like a year or 6 months or something?
Yeah, it kind of depends. If they've got a group of people, it obviously goes much faster. If it's just one person, that becomes a little more challenging.
Okay. All right. And where would they learn about that? You tell me. Where would they go to get more information about?
Again, it's just on the website. So you can go to arunaproject.com, and then there's just up at the top, there's a little place right there where you can click and drop down and apply.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because I thought that I had looked at that, but I only saw the shopping part of it. So I didn't realize there was more on that site.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I made you really talk a lot, but honestly, there's a lot to unravel and understand. And I feel so much lighter knowing from, whence they came to where they are, and the opportunity to do so much more is just really now ramping up in a major way. So I really encourage people to support you as best they can, and and learn more. And thank you so much for spending this time with me and our listeners, and giving us something to be very, very hopeful about and grateful for. So thank you.
Well, thanks, Deborah, and thank you for being a voice for the young women that we're working with. It's you're helping to amplify their voice, and so thank you for doing that.
All right, thanks. All right, take care and keep on keeping on, please. Thank you. All right, bye-bye.